So even better yet, Katherine she spent years developing incredible recipes that work for somebody with IBS. And so the magic of that is that you could go on to Monash University. You also could just make the recipes that she has, and they are incredibly easy, incredibly flavorful. I don't have IBS, but they make up the bulk of what I eat every day because they're fantastic. And how great is that, that you can just go and say, if I eat these things, her recipes will say things like, it'll add green onions, but just use the green part of the green onion because the white part can trigger IBS. It's just so marvelous.
Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Today's episode, guys, will be a very special episode for me because today we will touch on 2 diagnoses that have impacted my household the most. Those 2 diagnoses include Irritable Bowel Syndrome, or IBS, which I suffer from, and diabetes, which is the condition my wife has. So if you know anyone who has either of those 2 conditions, make sure to share this episode with them. But what may surprise you is that there are massive connections between IBS and insulin resistance, which is related to diabetes, not only causal, but also in terms of effective treatment strategies. So today, I will introduce you to 2 sisters who will shed some much needed light on the connection between IBS and diabetes. These 2 sisters are Sarah and Katherine Aitken, who both share a passion for spreading the word to as many people as possible about how to achieve and maintain their best health. I'll start with Katherine, who's a registered nurse, nutritionist, metabolic health practitioner, entrepreneur, CEO, coach, wife, and mother, a long list. After a lifelong struggle with irritable bowel syndrome, including episodes that were so severe they were mistaken for appendicitis. And she reluctantly accepted that she had IBS after looking at other causes. Feeling like most of us who are diagnosed with IBS, it was kind of like that generic diagnosis that they give you because nobody could figure things out. But after years of discomfort, Katherine eventually discovered what many of you have heard of, which is called the low FODMAP diet as a way to manage symptoms. And this was the turning point in her life. She was empowered because she had such dramatic improvement in her own symptoms. She decided to leverage her medical knowledge and love of cooking to develop her IBS Game Changer program to help people who were at the mercy of their IBS symptoms to regain control of their gut, learn to eat a vast array of delicious food, and to thrive. So I'm really excited about that since this is a condition I suffered from. Now, Sarah, her sister, is a woman's health nurse practitioner, a family nurse practitioner, a national board certified coach, and an accredited metabolic health practitioner. She spent most of her career working in internal medicine, similar to my type of practice. When she became a pre-diabetic, despite following the U.S. dietary guidelines, shout out to Nina Teichels, to focus on eating fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat foods, and not much meat, she decided to really educate herself about the causes of diabetes. And she came to realize we were given the wrong advice, with over 89% of the US adult population now experiencing insulin resistance. And on the road to diabetes, she realized the advice she was giving to her patients based on dietary guidelines was actually contributing to the problem. She has since reversed her own prediabetes, has lost over 90 pounds, and is now on a mission to help others to do the same. And with that, Sarah and Katherine, who look like twins, if you're watching on YouTube, I welcome you both to Protecting Your Nest.
Thank you. We're so happy to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. Before I actually changed my shirt, I was wearing a Low Carb USA shirt as I was working out. And I was like, should I keep that on? Because I know I meet a lot of great people like yourself at the Symposium for Metabolic Health and other conferences. So I want to do a shout out to Doug and Pam, who run these great conferences, which connects us all in the various other conferences like the Denver conference, et cetera. So for those who haven't been to any of these conferences, please do yourself a favor. Go and meet not only the influencers, the people who are sharing the knowledge, but the people who are also experiencing the benefits of this lifestyle change. So let's get started with our conversation. And I guess this is for both of you guys. You both ended up in the nursing field. So I'm curious how each of you ended there. Maybe we'll start with Sarah.
I was going to college and not really knowing what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I volunteered at a free clinic for migrant workers. This was in Central Valley in California. And it was staffed by a brand new profession called nurse practitioner, which was brand new back then. I'd never heard of it. And I was just enamored and thought that is what I want to do when I grow up. And it took me 10 years to, get my RN, work as an RN, do all the prerequisites. It took 10 years to get there, but it was oh so worth it. And it's just been the best profession in the world.
It is. And when we were doing our heroes in medicine because of COVID, for me personally, the nurses have always been some of the greatest heroes. They actually taught me before I started doing my more internal medicine type practice as a family doctor. I was delivering babies, and the first baby I delivered at Mount Sinai Hospital, I walk in there and they're like, "Are you the student doctor?" I was like, "Yes." They said, "Put these gloves on." I was like,
Oh, wow.
I don't know how to deliver a baby. I was like, well, you're about to learn because everybody else is in surgery. So shout out to all the nurses who are out there. And what about you, Katherine? What got you into nursing?
Well, so Sarah and I look like twins, although we're not. And we both have twins. And when
Nice.
I was pregnant with twins, I was on bed rest for 2 months. And at the time, I was working in marketing and advertising. And so I worked remotely way back then before working remote was even a thing. And then I had my twins. And then they were in the intensive care for 9 days and 11 days, respectively. And so I spent a lot of time with all of these just incredible people who were making sure that my twins came into the world and thrived. And I thought to myself, in the grand scheme of things, marketing and advertising does not matter nearly as much as this. And so after my twins were born, with my infant twins, I decided I'm going to move on from my bachelor's degree and get a degree in natural science and a degree in nursing. And then I'm going to work at Stanford because that's where my kids were delivered. And so I did all that. It was back in the 90s. That was at the time when HIV and AIDS was really a profoundly terrible disease. It was pretty much a terminal diagnosis. And these patients needed the sort of care that comes from the heart and is unconditional. And so that's what I did for a number of years until my kids got a little bit older. And then I realized, gosh, this schedule is a little bit too restrictive. So I leaned back into my marketing and advertising and have started my own company and have supported my life that way and kept my nursing license active all these years. And in 2020, decided to re-leverage my medical experience to develop my IBS Game Changer program.
Nice. Well, having those skills are incredible. I just interviewed a gentleman by the name of Jules Anaker. I think he's working with the Metabolic Mind with Dr. Brett Scher and Dr. Georgia Eid, et cetera, to help market. So what we need in the low carb keto carnivore community is marketing folk to help get this message out. And I really am happy that you have a background in that area. And of course, having Jules on the team as well is very helpful. So now beyond nursing, you guys have chosen your areas of focus. It may be obvious why Katherine, why you decided to go with IBS, maybe based on the intro, but maybe I'll start with you, Katherine. Let's talk a little bit about why you really wanted to, lean into that.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, lifelong struggle with IBS, ended up in the emergency room a couple of times, really, in so much pain I couldn't stand up. And I really it took me a long time to figure out that I had IBS. And, when you see a doctor, you're a doctor, you don't get a lot of training in nutrition. So
Mm-mm.
basically, you tell your patient, you have IBS, here's the low FODMAP diet, you get kind of a one pager and, sent on your way.
That's
And there was a lot of denial in me
right. Mm-hmm.
about, what is IBS? It's just, this sort of catch all. And it doesn't really mean anything. And I just ignored it for years and continued on with my gut symptoms. And then once I figured it out, I really felt like it was my duty to share what I had learned. I have medical training. I was, I love to cook. I was willing to do lots of research, and I was willing to, change my diet, change my exercise, change my hydration, all of the things that made a difference. And yeah, I felt like it was my duty to share.
It's your duty. Shout out to all the clinicians, no matter what type of clinician you are, doctor, nurse, pharmacist, like my wife. She said it was her duty. And I want to say that out loud to, at least in a clinical setting, even if you're not sharing some of the things you may be doing personally with these diets, please make sure your patients know that food is medicine, and they need to hear that while you're prescribing whatever you're prescribing. And I think the more they hear that, the more they'll take it seriously, and they shouldn't have to go to a podcast to get this
Right?
information, right? So I appreciate you you having a course. And Sarah, talk a little bit about why you decided to focus on diabetes.
Well, yeah, working in internal medicine all those years, I mean, as you know, you literally hundreds, maybe thousands of people with diabetes in your practice. It's
Yes.
like so common. And I started practice in the early 1980s, and over the course of 30 years, it like became more and more and more common. And you've got to start thinking like, what is up with that?
Right.
If measles, if we thought we'd cured measles and yet it got more and more and more common, we would not think that we cured measles. And yet
Right.
we think our food guidelines are working because why? So it was just so discouraging. I had so many conversations with diabetics where I would say, I'm going to start you on metformin, and diabetes is a progressive disorder. It's going to get worse. Eventually, we'll have to add more medicine. And, I'd send them to the dietitian, and they would get the dietitian advice, and their diabetes would indeed get worse.
Mhm.
It just always happened that way. And it was very discouraging. So when I was diagnosed with prediabetes, plus I was having a lot of trouble managing my weight, um, that the research I did into what exactly is going on physiologically,
Mhm.
that was profound. And a lot of this just isn't out there, and it isn't what dietitians teach. It's not what the RDAs and all of our national guidelines support. And I just was like astounded, absolutely astounded. And then I worked on, okay, what can I do here to match my body's
Mhm.
physiology? And at the time, I didn't really realize that what I was doing was controlling various different carbs. And I didn't really have names for what I was doing, but I was just following the physiology of how does a body interact with food. And there you go. And then as time went on, I discovered the metabolic health community. I discovered I wasn't all by myself. It is and was awkward, as you've probably experienced, because a lot of the old guard medical establishment
Mhm.
still adheres to a different paradigm, I guess. So we're kind of going it one person at a time, helping people understand their physiology. And now my practice is 100% diabetes reversal and insulin resistance reversal. That's all I do. And now I get to take people off medicine. I get to watch them reverse this disorder. In the medical community, they're calling it remission, and I refuse to call it that because it's
Mhm.
reversible.
It
And
is.
so there you go. It's just like so highly rewarding and so important.
Yeah, and I know I try to speak to the general public as we have these conversations, but I'm going to have to say something to my clinicians again. What would it be like to have to convert your practice from this medication adherence model to one where you have to be expert at deprescribing model?
Yeah.
What would that feel like to have people coming to the clinic and they're so excited? They're so excited because today is the get off metformin day, or today is I'm going to get off my daily, my mealtime insulin, and I'm only doing that, once a day insulin. Then eventually I'm gonna get off that. What would it be like to practice that way? It would change not only those people's lives, but certainly how we feel. So I'm so happy you guys have benefited. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here because we make assumptions about what people understand and know. So I'm going to circle back to Katherine for this. And I'm being selfish because IBS is my thing, right? We'll deal with my wife's diabetes in a moment. So let's spend a moment, Katherine, for those who may not even know what IBS is. If you could just spend a moment sharing, let's help the average Joe, that fifth grader, even understand what IBS is, so we won't make assumptions about what people know about it. Share what you want to share about that.
Yeah, sounds great. So IBS is one of those diagnoses that is made in the process of exclusion. So when you're having all of these symptoms of gas and bloating and sometimes diarrhea and sometimes constipation and lots of pain and discomfort, you go in and you have all the tests to confirm that it's not celiac, it's not Crohn's disease,
Right.
it's not irritable bowel disease, it's not any of these diseases that cause permanent damage to your gut. Really important to rule those out so that we know what we're treating.
That's right.
And people with IBS, they may have some of the same symptoms that people without IBS have, but in addition to that, they have what's called visceral hypersensitivity, which is that your guts really are more sensitive than other people's guts. So somebody else might, eat a bunch of cruciferous vegetables and get a bunch of gas in their gut and not even know it, and it doesn't bother them at all.
Right.
And somebody with IBS can have that same exact meal and be in huge pain.
Yeah.
So the great thing about IBS, as I mentioned, is it doesn't cause permanent damage to your gut. So the way that we treat it can be extremely customized to the person who has it, and really pay attention to what are their symptoms, what is their lifestyle, what are they willing to change, and what are they not willing to change. So it's not a lifelong condition as long as you're willing to educate yourself or be educated by a helpful coach. You're probably not going to find a lot of in-depth education with your GI doc, right? They just don't have the time in modern medicine to teach you about how to manage your symptoms. And it really is a holistic management of symptoms. We talk about the nest on this podcast, right?
Yes.
So nutrition is very, very important. We'll talk about the low FODMAP diet in a little bit, in a little more depth, but also your exercise, your sleep,
Yes.
your thoughts about, your symptoms and hydration and how much you travel. Like all of these things are really an important piece of managing IBS and can completely change your trajectory from being shut in and out of control to being totally free to live your life totally in control of your symptoms. So
Yeah,
we'll
I
talk
like
a little
that.
bit more about diet and food later, but
Yeah.
that's the kind of the nutshell.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And I want to make sure people hear that this is not just, I can personally attest to the changes that I have helped me, which were nutritional, et cetera, and the stress reduction and the sleep. But going back to this idea of how you practice medicine, man, those GI doctors who have not incorporated this way of thinking into their practice, they're going to really feel like healers when they do. And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that they really start to realize that, yeah, they got some great medicines. I just heard, I was listening. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I've been spending some time at home with my wife, and they got a new medicine they can give you. if you're in the middle of a allergy. Well, actually, one's to help you if you have a seizure, and you can give a medicine while they're having a seizure. It's a nasal spray, which is crazy. And then there was another medicine that came out as well, that you take twice a month so you can reduce your risk for allergic reactions. That's great. We love technology. We love the innovation, but to miss this opportunity to treat, medical conditions with nutrition has been, for lack of a better way of looking at it, it's just been, we've missed that opportunity. So I really am happy you found another approach. I found another approach, and let's see what Sarah has to say. Instead of just focusing on diabetes, I think most people have a sense of what that is, but a lot of people are still not sure about insulin resistance. So maybe if you can take a moment, like your sister, I feel like singing "We Are Family," everybody, because we got the sisters. I feel like singing,
Whip
but
out the
this is the
sister
first
song.
time I think I've done a podcast with two sisters, but anyway, if you can talk a little bit, Sarah, about the insulin resistance and what that means and what people need to know about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll first make a brief distinction between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, the pancreas really shuts down, stops producing insulin. Those people have to take insulin for the rest of
Yep.
their lives.
Yep.
That being said, if they alter their diet in a way that doesn't provoke glucose overload, they can take less insulin, but they
Right.
do have to take insulin. It's a totally different animal. There's no insulin. Type 2 diabetes is, well, I'll start out with insulin resistance because it's a continuum. So insulin resistance is a normal physiological mechanism to prevent glucose overload of the cells. So the cells that in your circulation, you need 5 grams of glucose at any one time. That's all you need. That's 1 teaspoon of glucose in your circulation at any one time. When you eat something where that level rises above 5 grams, any cells that happen to need glucose, they get it. Insulin is what facilitates the cells getting their necessary glucose. But as soon as the cell is full and it doesn't need more, it becomes resistant to insulin. This is a normal evolutionary strategy to avoid glucose overload. And then insulin moves to say, oh, okay, the cell is all full. I'm going to now tell the liver, excuse me, I'm going to tell the liver to store the extra glucose as fat, turns it into triglycerides, stores it as fat. And that's just a normal thing. This is how bears get fat prior to hibernation. They become highly insulin resistant. They're like fat storage machines.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to live off their fat all winter. And in fact, if you look at every single animal, they utilize insulin resistance to store fat. Storing fat is an evolutionary advantage. So we do that just like all the other animals. When we have a big influx of glucose, our cells become resistant, then we store the extra as fat. And Mother Nature's assumption is there will be a famine. There will be a time when I'm stuck in the cave in a big blizzard outside and I've got to live off that fat. So cool. This is a perfect system. But we do live in 2024 and we don't have those circumstances anymore. Plus, we've got these massive influxes of glucose over and over again every day because we don't really understand what we're doing. So insulin resistance is a normal phenomenon. I look at type 2 diabetes as a repetitive stress injury. Over and over again, every day, if you're bombarded with glucose overload, then insulin resistance becomes chronic. It's there all the time. Eventually, the chronicity of it reaches what really is an arbitrary threshold where we diagnose it as prediabetes. It's just somewhere on the continuum. We made up the number. It's not based on anything really. And then another place on that continuum, we diagnose with type 2 diabetes. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all the same thing. It's just that you hit thresholds where we name it differently, but insulin resistance is the same thing. And although it's normal, it's not working for us to utilize it the way we are in 2024.
Nice. I've said on previous episodes that my favorite bear has been Winnie the Pooh over the years, and I I had a room decorated with Winnie the Pooh stuff, and I was such a fan that my first child, his room was decorated with Winnie the Pooh. He didn't know any better, but I love the thinking about the bear and that they become insulin resistant, as is other animals. And when you were saying that, the first thing I went to in my brain was, sounds like we need to hibernate from some of the things that turn into seriously. Think of hibernation from the foods that turn into sugar in our body. So I really like that analogy. And since we're talking about diabetes, I think I'm going to stay with Sarah for a little bit. And I want you to do me a favor and just provide some clarity between, like, what's the connection between IBS and insulin resistance? Just share a little bit more about how people need to think about that.
To kind of explain that, you have to start with thinking about what creates in IBS, what creates all that gas, all that discomfort, all the things that create an incredibly painful gut and a gut that's not working well. It's fermentation happening inside of the GI tract where it's not supposed to happen. Those with IBS process their food differently in their GI tract. We don't fully understand all of the mechanisms of why that happens, but it does happen. So where I, who do not have IBS, where I might eat a food, I've processed it such that it's not going to ferment in my GI tract and I'm going to be fine. Where Katherine might eat that same food and it arrives in her colon unprocessed, and what do you need for fermentation to happen? You have to have glucose. Fermentation does not happen unless you have glucose. So the only foods that ferment are the foods that contain glucose. The only foods that contain glucose are various carbohydrates. All carbohydrates include glucose. Some of them are more accessible. The glucose is more accessible than others. So this food arrives in the GI tract, ferments, they're miserable. The crossover, the link, is that many of those same foods, well, they contain glucose. They contain glucose. That's where we get our glucose overload episodes, is when we eat food that contains glucose. And primarily we're talking about natural foods, foods made by Mother Nature. We're not talking about processed foods. Those are a huge problem in itself, but we're talking about natural foods. So for instance, wheat, that's a pretty common one. So someone with IBS, that wheat is going to arrive in the colon and it'll just get fermented and they're totally miserable. For me, if I eat wheat, all that glucose, I'm going to have a total glucose overload from that, and that will contribute to my prediabetes. So the crossover is foods that contain glucose, and many of the categories are exactly the same. Does that answer your question?
That really does, and that's why I asked that question, because as we our job as clinicians is to help connect the dots.
Yeah.
And then the patient's job is to do the experiment. And because I love the fact that you guys are helping us understand is an individual situation. Some people can tolerate certain things that others can't. And I just think that's really important as we kind of have this conversation. I do want to, for those who are dealing with IBS and thinking about this connection to insulin resistant, talk a little bit about the overlap in the treatment of those two conditions, how they're related.
Katherine, you want to take this one or you want me to?
No, why don't you go ahead? I think it's a great follow-on.
Yeah. Okay. So the treatment for, just to kind of put it in a really general nutshell, the treatment for somebody with insulin resistance will be to limit those foods where the starch, that's the name for glucose stored in a food, the starch is easily accessible. So usually that means it's not bound with fiber. So there are certain obvious categories where the starch / glucose, it's the same thing, are easily accessible. So to treat insulin resistance, you're going to avoid those foods high in starches. We don't necessarily have to avoid carbs. We just need to avoid the carbs that are high in starch, high in easily accessible glucose. So what are those foods? Grains, vegetables that grow below the ground, milk, peas, corn, fruit, dried fruit, fruit juice, processed foods, added sugars. Those are kind of, that's it in a nutshell, honestly. And with somebody with IBS, within those categories, within pretty much every single one of those categories, there are crossover of those same foods. So I'm going to turn it over to Katherine to talk for a minute, if it's okay, about how, what foods to avoid for IBS. You can't quantify it quite as easily as I just did for insulin resistance, but I know she's got things to say about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's part of the hardest part with IBS and the nutrition piece is there's this acronym, which is FODMAP, and we've said that a couple of times, which stands for very long carbohydrates that are fermentable, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, etc. Right? We don't want to say that every time we're talking about these long chain carbohydrates that tend to ferment in your gut. So we use the acronym FODMAP, and there's kind of no logic in figuring out which foods are high in FODMAPs and which foods are not high in FODMAPs, other than to know that all FODMAPs are carbohydrates. So any food that shows as no carbohydrates, meats, fish, poultry, for example, will not have FODMAPs in them as long as they're not marinated in something that does. So when we're talking about figuring out what foods might trigger your symptoms when you have IBS, it's really important to have a lot of help. And Monash University in Australia is kind of the gold standard on that help. They have a huge lab wherein they have chopped up all these foods and put them in test tubes and tested them for the presence of FODMAPs. And they've created a great app. I have no relationship with them. I get no benefit for promoting them, but they really are the gold standard in helping people to understand what foods they can eat in what quantity so as not to trigger symptoms. So the Monash app, which you can get on all the app stores, just search Monash and FODMAP. They use a stoplight system that has all of the different FODMAPs. And so you can see for each food exactly what FODMAP might be in that food. And so if you know you're particularly sensitive to that one, you can reduce your serving size and not trigger yourself. So that's kind of the basics on figuring out the foods. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
I like that. I wonder, how do you spell the name of that app again?
Monash. It's just like it sounds, Monash.
That's what I was hoping to hear you say. Okay, I just wanted to
app
make
has
sure.
a little gut on it.
A little gut, appropriate.
It's very appropriate.
That's cool. I wanted to, Katherine, ask you about, again, I kind of self-diagnosed myself with IBS, but I'm not sure what a doctor would have said if I had gone to a doctor. And we know doctors have typical recommendations about how to treat it. So, and I got a sense that our audience knows the answer to this question, but why do you think the treatments they normally recommend are not as effective?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, doctors don't have the time that really is needed to educate someone about what is IBS, what causes the symptoms, and how to really manage it. So, basically, what we get from the typical medical provider is they've ruled out everything else that can cause permanent damage. They diagnose you with IBS. They give you a one-pager on the FODMAP diet and tell you, eat this way and you'll be fine.
Yep.
And they may also prescribe medications to correct if you have constipation or diarrhea, or you alternate between the two, which is very common. So specifically on the medications, and with my clients, I try to avoid having them take medications altogether, because what happens is we get this great pendulum swing, right? I've got diarrhea. I take medication to get rid of the diarrhea. Oh no, I have constipation. I take medication to get rid of the constipation. And I'm never I never reach sort of an even keel. And the other thing is with IBS is we don't ever want patients to walk away thinking, oh, I need to be gluten-free, I need to be lactose-free, I need to never eat this, that, or the other thing. The education that we want to give them to support the healthy gut biome is that we want you to eat everything. We just maybe want you to reduce your serving size so it doesn't trigger a symptom. So, Tony, you mentioned Brussels sprouts on a previous
Yes,
podcast.
that's right.
Well, if you
That's
eat
right.
more than 2 Brussels sprouts, you're going to trigger your symptoms.
Just 2.
Exactly. And 2 Brussels sprouts does not feel like very many. So
That's right.
there's the education, and the app really helps you to understand, okay, avocado, love avocado, but I can only eat a third of an avocado without triggering symptoms. So great. Eat a
Yeah.
third of an avocado.
That's right. That's right.
And
Yeah.
doctors do not have time to spend with you.
No.
So you get the one pager, you get some meds, you go on your way, and then you're left to kind of figure it out on your own. And what happens is, because people don't really understand the FODMAP diet and there is no logic, then they end up triggering themselves all over the place all the time, have no idea why they're triggering themselves or how. And so each day they think, well, I was fine yesterday and now I feel terrible and I have no idea why. And so they kind of paint themselves into a corner in terms of what they eat, which often is, for example, chicken and steamed white rice, right? Okay, I can eat that. I feel fine. I'm just going to eat that all the time. Well, anybody who treats kids knows the brat diet is a great way to get rid of diarrhea, and it's very constipating. And the brat diet is bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast.
Right.
So
That's
we
right.
eat all this rice and we end up with constipation and we have no idea why. And nothing that we do is improving our circumstances. And at the same time, we're really limiting what we eat. And so our gut biome is down there saying, hey, I need some more variety. I'm only growing the bad guys down here and they just want more of what's bad for you. So it's all tied together.
Yeah, a lot of work to just pay attention. That Monash app will be on my phone soon. Although I'm more of a carnivore, my wife always looks at me funny about, you need to try this and that, because she's ketovore. And at the end of the day, it's nice to know that there's a way to kind of know, if I have my moments of indulgence, for lack of better words, I'll know which things I can and can't do, because I do believe that many people don't have to go to the extreme of carnivore, and they can kind of ease back in. But if you're going to ease back in, let's do it in a way with some data, some science to support those decisions. So I really love that. I want to,
Tony, can I add
yeah,
something in there?
yeah,
So
Sarah.
even better yet, Katherine she spent years developing incredible recipes
Oh
that
yeah,
work for somebody with IBS. And so the magic of that is that you could go on to Monash University, cool, but you
yes,
also could just make the recipes that she has, and they are incredibly easy, incredibly flavorful. I don't have IBS, but they make up the bulk of what I eat every day because they're fantastic. And how great is that, that you can just go and say, if I eat these things, her recipes will say things like, it'll add green onions, but just use the green part of the green onion because the white part
right.
can trigger IBS. It's just so marvelous.
Wow. That's really cool. I really appreciate that. And again, having a resource, and we'll make sure to share those in the video slash podcast notes, is so critical, and it empowers people to do the things that their doctor didn't have time to teach them, as you
Yeah.
have suggested. I want to stay with you, Sarah, for a moment and just ask you about. I mentioned, when I talked to Katherine about, what doctors would recommend for a IBS diet, the same is true. Same question for the doctors who recommend a diet for people with diabetes. So why are the diets recommended by doctors and the American Diabetes Association not really serving people well for diabetes?
Oh, that question just raises my blood pressure every time. Well, I think part of it stems from
Mhm.
us conflating type 1 and type 2 as if they're the same thing, and thinking of it as a blood sugar problem
Mhm.
instead of an insulin problem.
Right.
And so we we think of it kind of backwards for type 2, but the recommendations started way back when, and even way back when they were influenced by, well, of course they were influenced by what they knew at the time, which was not a whole lot. Plus, we didn't have the foods that we have nowadays. So the recommendations typically, I mean, how many times have you heard this? Eat lots of fruits and vegetables, eat whole grains, limit meat, and for sure eat a low fat diet. Like, how many times? And to my shame, how many times have I said that to my clients?
Right.
And then the other thing I've said is a calorie is a calorie. It's calories in, calories out. No. Food interacts with our body in a specific way. You can have 1,000 calories of broccoli and lose weight. Not that I'm recommending that. And 1,000 calories of rice and gain weight like nobody's business. And it's because it influences insulin. It's interacting with insulin differently.
Yeah. And I wonder, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so the RDAs, or the recommendations, are just kind of fraught with problems at this point. Old beliefs. It's very slow to change government recommendations. There are a lot of stakeholders now in making recommendations, including food companies, and it's just gotten kind of miserably muddy. And this is why with my clients, I use a continuous glucose monitor 100% of the time. And this is why, because it ends the discussions about what foods raise blood sugar. It ends those discussions. Sure, go to the dietitian, learn what the dietitian tells you for diabetes, and try that while wearing a CGM. And then try thinking about it differently. How do foods interact with your body? And try it differently and see what happens. And you can't unsee what you just saw. That's what teaches you. I see it as a very important bio tool to teach you how your body is interacting with foods. I listed the main foods, and I could just tell you, avoid all these things and you'll be fine. And you would. But there's like Katherine is talking, there's nuances. For instance, if you love beans, maybe, and beans raise your blood sugar, there might be ways to eat beans that less raise your blood sugar, like have it at the end of the meal or have it mixed with X, Y, and Z. There's all these nuances that you can play with. So the RDA, I think, is just fraught with, not RDA, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, and dietitians have to adhere to that.
That's right.
Just about, I think it was 2 years ago, dietitians started to be allowed to recommend a low carbohydrate diet for their clients. And now the way they sort of present choices, but I don't think they spend the time to educate that it's only carbs that contain glucose. Other foods do not. Yeah. I mean, they do a tiny bit, but it's carbohydrates.
Yeah, there's still
anyway, I could
fear.
go on and on about this.
Yeah, there's still some fear. There's still some reluctance. And when I refer to nutrition professionals who are doing wonderful work, they still hesitate. So I have to say, we're going to do a certain dietary pattern, and in my world, it tends to be low carb, keto, things like that. And they're still hesitant to do it. They do follow your lead, but they are. It feels like they're still being told that's not the ideal diet, and if you do it, it should be temporary. There's some potential harm. So I think we're still evolving. Yeah. And that's why we have to have conversations like this. And before I wanted to ask Katherine a question, I do want to ask Sarah another question, which is, what's your thoughts on why so many people are still unaware that diabetes can be reversed? So many people are still like, huh? I still see people and they're like, what do you mean? I thought I was going to be on insulin forever. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was interesting. Dexcom just came out with an over-the-counter version of a continuous glucose monitor called Stello, and I was talking to the local rep in my area about Stello, and I was describing my practice of diabetes reversal, and here he is working for Dexcom, and he said, "Diabetes reversal? What's that? I didn't know you could even do that." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, he didn't even know it was we use the word remission. He didn't even know that was a thing.
Right.
And oh my gosh, for gosh sakes. So we're so used to thinking of it as a progressive illness because that's what we see a day in and day out. And we see it because they're not given education on how their body interacts with food.
Yeah.
Patients are not given that education for all kinds of reasons. So it's seen as progressive. One interesting thing about medication for diabetes is that medication makes people think, I'm doing something about it. And then it sort of stops them from worrying about it. Oh, I can eat ice cream because I'm on medication. See, look,
Right.
my blood
Right.
pressure, my blood sugar is
Yeah.
fine. But what they don't realize is that the medicines for diabetes, including insulin, virtually all of them, it's not like they disappear the sugar that you just ate. It doesn't leap out of your body and no
Right.
longer hurt you. It simply moves from your bloodstream to somewhere else in your body. And
Yeah.
remember at the beginning, I was talking about how glucose overload is toxic to cells. Well, we're contributing to that toxicity
Right.
by adding medication for diabetes, and yet we're making the person feel complacent about their blood sugars. No, that's not what's happening. And that's why the medicines for diabetes protect you against something called diabetic ketoacidosis, where you're in critical danger from high blood sugar, but they don't protect you from any of the chronic illnesses caused by diabetes. Diabetes is still progressive, whether you're on
That's right.
medicine or not.
That's
That is a
huge.
huge, huge disconnect right there.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those studies I still remember. One called the Accord study, and others which showed even with tight control on insulin,
Yeah.
people were still having those complications.
Yeah.
The VA, Veterans Administration did a study, same thing, tight control, and they still had what we call macrovascular disease,
Yeah.
which are the heart attacks, strokes, and things like that.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you kind of putting that in front of people, because people, you can't solve this problem with medicine. You can't just give the antidote
Right.
when you haven't gotten rid of the, poison, which is excessive consumption of carbs. So,
Yeah.
and I love that the rep for Dexcom is now aware,
Mhm.
which is why I think these conversations are important. It's about gaining knowledge, because now the good thing about Dexcom is they're going to do okay regardless, because a lot of people who reverse type 2 diabetes still want to have the data.
Yeah.
They're still going to want to have that. And that data will literally, if we had never had this conversation and nobody in front of us was aware of what to eat, give them a Dexcom and they'll learn what to eat, because the Dexcom will tell them
Yes.
that
Yeah.
ice cream you mentioned was probably not the best choice. So I really love, again, technology, and we need to make sure people who are out there, being salespeople for technology understand the many benefits. And I would sell it and say, hey, this is going to help you get off of your medicine,
Yeah.
and then it'll
Yeah.
help you maintain that. So
Right.
you're going to need me to help you do that with this product. So I just think it makes sense. If my wife, I remember during the pandemic, I kept seeing these Amazon boxes keep coming to my house, right? I was like, what's in it? It was a mystery box. My wife kept ordering stuff from Amazon, right? But so it's like, if you're getting excess packages in the form of sugar to your body, and you just call the
Excess
people and say,
Amazon
stop
deliveries.
delivering those sugar packages, right? And that's all we're asking people to do as we use this Amazon analogy. So I want to circle back to Katherine real quick and go back to IBS. I hope we're not confusing people going back and forth. But when it comes to the low FODMAP diet, is there, it almost feels like a preventive thing, but when it comes to flares, where is there a role that this diet plays in that as well?
Yeah, you bet. Great question, Tony. And we will bring this all together. What does it all mean and how do each impact each other very
Yeah.
quickly? So about 85% of the population have IBS, whether they've been diagnosed or not. And that's global population. So it's really crazy to think about how many people are out there suffering. The low FODMAP diet was developed specifically for people with IBS to remove or reduce the foods that contain those carbohydrates that trigger symptoms. And the interesting thing about the low FODMAP diet is it's not intended to be a diet that you go on for your whole life. It's intended to be used for about a 6 to 8 week period to go very low FODMAP and then calm your system down and then introduce one FODMAP at a time. So one of those long chain carbohydrates at a time. So you mentioned Winnie the Pooh. Well, Winnie the Pooh probably did not have IBS because honey is a huge trigger because it's solid fructose. So what we do is we turn the patient or client into a petri dish, and we drop in one of those carbohydrates at a time, and then we increase the amount over the course of 3 days, and we see how they respond. And the Monash app has a great little set of slide bars where you can say, I'm super reactive to fructose, that one FODMAP, and I'll slide that bar way over to a frowny face on fructose. And then those serving sizes get adjusted to accommodate for your personal profile. So the low FODMAP diet really shouldn't even be called a diet. It should be called a tool, right? We use it to calm the system down, to test the system, and then return to it if ever we do have a flare up. We've gone to a wedding and we've eaten everything on the table, and then we need to calm our system down. It's a great thing to come home to. But separate from that, as I mentioned previously, we want your gut biome to have exposure to as much variety as possible. So we always want to push the limits on how much of something can you eat. But diet is a very big component. And I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. I said 85% of the population have it. That's not correct. 85% of people who have IBS respond very well to control by way of nutrition. So the low FODMAP diet. So it is a great tool. And I'm going to segue just a little bit into some of the other things that affect flare-ups, because it's really important to look at it holistically, right? Nutrition, definitely one thing. It's the first thing we tackle because most people have no idea how they're triggering themselves with their diet. But also regular exercise, which can be as simple as, a 10 or 15 minute walk every day, right? Work your way up. It doesn't mean that you have to go to, Barry's boot camp and do a high intensity interval workout every day, right? You can work slowly, do what works for you, get enough sleep. Don't continue the cycle of, I have a sensitive stomach, I can't eat anything, I'm stuck at home, I have no control. Get on top of that by getting on top of your symptoms so that then you can change that narrative in your head to be like, I'm great. I have full control. I know exactly what to eat. I'm going to do my walking. I'm going to get my sleep. I'm going to drink my water. But one of the biggest things with IBS that's one of the hardest hurdles to get over is caffeine. And that's because caffeine is a smooth muscle trigger. It increases the rate of our peristalsis, which is the speed at which your gut passes food through. It can be a big contributor to diarrhea and just like gurgly gut and pain in general. And so I do work with clients to reduce their caffeine intake over the course of multiple weeks.
That's right.
To the point that it works for them. So
Yeah.
all of these things need to be taken together.
That's right. It's so funny. And shout out to Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts with those long lines. And and there's something emotional about coffee.
Yeah.
I mean, starting your day with coffee is warm. It's I don't know, even if you make it the right way. I don't tolerate caffeine. So before I even had this conversation, I've learned that coffee is not my friend. I've kind of and this is an interesting thing. I can't think of the company right now, but there's a company that has caffeine infused toothpicks. And for some reason, isn't that crazy? I know
Wow.
it's crazy. I just found them, and what I found is that I don't have as much problem sucking on a toothpick with caffeine when I need it. I do not do caffeine if I don't need it, but there are times when late meetings or whatever. But I just want to say I agree. People love coffee, but for people like myself, for those who tolerate it, have at it. But for me, it's just pushing my luck. So
Yep.
that's why, for me, this is as I started with, a very personal podcast, because I already have, new resources. I'm going to take advantage of all of them, but I'm still learning. And one thing I want to say out loud, although we're clinicians and people may look at us as experts, we're just learning. I'm going to be trying some of your recipes. I just think we have to be open to being better tomorrow compared to yesterday. And I think that's where we're going with conversations like this. Now, let's get into the weeds just a little bit, because the framing of this conversation is kind of connecting the dots between IBS, insulin resistance, diabetes, et cetera. So I'll go to Sarah for this and ask a simple question. How is diabetes a potential cause of IBS? That sounds crazy,
Yeah.
but I want to hear what you have to say
I
about
know,
that.
it is super interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
insulin is so powerful. It literally affects every single cell in our body in one way or
Mhm.
another. Insulin is the only hormone that does that has a role in every single cell. So insulin resistance can contribute to IBS in a number of different ways. High blood sugars damage nerves. You've probably heard of that. I mean, I don't know you've heard of that, but your audience has probably heard of
That's
that,
right.
where people will get something called peripheral neuropathy. They lose sensation in their feet, and that can lead to injuries of the feet, which cause gangrene, and then they lose their toes, and nerve damage. And what's happening there is the sugar, the glucose overload is sugar is literally attaching to all of our cells,
That's right.
including nerve cells. When we measure blood sugar, when we measure something called the hemoglobin A1C, which gives us an average of what the blood sugars have been for the past 3 months, what we're measuring is how much sugar is attached to a red blood cell. It's a sugar coated red blood cell. And the only reason we use blood for that is it's super easy to measure that. You can draw blood and measure it. But all of your cells become sugar coated when there's continual bombardment of too much glucose. Nerves don't tolerate that. So you damage the nerves, that will affect how fast food moves through the gut. High blood sugar slows emptying of the stomach. That can lead to nausea, bloating, a sense of fullness. There's a higher risk of fungal infections and bacterial infections in the gut when blood sugars are high. And then insulin resistance interferes with the ability to properly break down sugars in the small intestine. So if you already have that propensity, this is going to make matters worse. So insulin resistance helps cause IBS in all those different ways. And then IBS contributes to causing insulin resistance. I don't know if you want me to go over that or Katherine to go over that, but both things contribute to each other.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'll jump in
Yeah,
on
go
that
ahead,
one.
Catherine.
Yeah. So I've talked about gut biome multiple times, right? We have to have a good variety of what we put in our mouth in order to have a healthy gut biome. And changes in that gut biome can contribute to the development of insulin resistance. Nutrient absorption is also altered when you think of a person who has either diarrhea or constipation or a combination of the two. Food is either going through way too fast or way too slow. And the way that you absorb nutrients throughout your digestive system, from the mouth all the way to the other end, is changed. IBS influences the digestion of fats, and fats can also the glucose that you eat with those fats can also contribute to the development of IBS. And I also mentioned people sort of eating themselves into a corner, trying to figure out what's triggering them, and so they end up eating a lot of steamed white rice. Well, if you think about rice, right, especially white rice, all the fiber has been removed. It's a highly accessible starch. And so if I'm eating rice and chicken all day long, I'm hitting my glucose, spiking my glucose over and over again. And so, kind of the way that we eat when we have IBS, I've had clients that come to me that eat all kinds of crazy things because they've figured out that's the thing that I can tolerate. And limitation of food, speed with which it goes through your gut, absorption of glucose with the combination of fats, and exactly what you're eating all contributes to developing insulin resistance.
Yeah, that's cool. So again, I think, and I know we kind of touched on kind of like the concept of this episode towards the end, and you guys explaining that I think is very helpful. It's really inspiring to know that the solutions are not more medicine, but lifestyle changes. So I think that empowers people to start their journey. Obviously, you want to keep your doc, your clinician aware, but it's so nice to know that you can do something about it and you're going to fix a lot of problems, not just IBS or diabetes, but a ton of other things. So I want you guys to share a message for anybody suffering from IBS or diabetes. What message would you share with them?
Sarah, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think the message would, well, number one, both of these are reversible slash controllable.
Right.
Both of these are reversible. I loved how when Katherine was describing painting yourself into a corner with the small, narrow group of foods that you feel like you can eat. Well, the exact same thing happens to people who are trying to manage their weight. They go on a diet, a small, little, narrow range of foods, and they become, extremely frustrated. It's not a way to live. They go off of it and go crazy. And then they're miserable. And that's I loved that analogy there. But the message is you can eat like a king and still control both IBS
Mhm.
and insulin resistance. There's no restriction there. There's bountiful choices.
That's right.
It's there's just like this world of delicious food available to you. It just takes a little bit of sciencing yourself, either for IBS or insulin resistance, to figure out what bounty of food works well for you, and there lies sustainability right there.
Wow. And I just want to say this real quick. Um, that, as a carnivore, for all the carnivores out there who are wanting to get back to some plants, I think that'll open up a window of opportunity.
Mhm.
And I just interviewed Stephanie. Her channel is called Stephanie Keto Person, and she's a big advocate for not going too extreme. And if you're not going to go to the extreme, you need to know how to not do that. So I just want to say that out loud. I'm not suggesting I won't be a carnivore. I'm suggesting that for those who want to move in that direction, this provides hope.
Mhm.
I just want to feel good.
Yeah.
I just want to be able to go on a stage and speak and not be thinking about my stomach the whole time I'm speaking.
Yeah.
And by the way, we will be again on stage in Washington. This episode will be out before then, October the 13th. I think Nina Teichol's led the Metabolic Revolution rally, and I feel like screaming right now. I want to scream
Yes.
loud that we do not have to go back to
Yes.
what we previously had to deal with because we didn't have knowledge. We don't have to go back to that. So,
Mhm.
so I'm really excited about that. But I'll let Katherine share any thoughts you want to share for the people.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. To Sarah's point, any diet that we undertake that isn't something that we can do lifelong is a waste of time.
Yeah,
Everyone's heard of Whole 30, nothing against Whole 30, but something like that where you're so restricting the things that you can eat. And then when you're done with 30 days, boom, you just eat it
that's
all,
right.
you feel horrible, and you reverse any possible benefit you might have had from doing that. So That's why, specifically with IBS sufferers, we really push the limits of, yes, you can eat that, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to be no sugar. You're not going to be no milk, where you're not going to be no wheat, right? You're going to eat a bit of those things. And from the standpoint of those people who have both IBS and prediabetes, I have a collection of recipes that are keto friendly recipes on my recipe club, and we'll share the link to that. But it even makes it that much easier to create a recipe that's IBS friendly, that is also low carb. And the development of those recipes came from the fact that a few years ago, my sister got me wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and
Mm,
together we discovered that I am pre-diabetic. And I had no reason to think that I was or would
right.
be. And I was sort of watching my A1C trajectory going up and up. And my doctor said to me, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just put you on medication when you hit that arbitrary threshold that Sarah mentioned. And that's where I said, no, I know I have information
Right.
that makes me an expert at reversing this situation. And so, I'm sort of my own best science project, and I'm really looking forward to being able to show that peak and then decline in my
Yeah.
A1C to my doctor, so that she can then have an N=1 case study that she can
That's
share
right.
with some of her other patients.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to say that we've shared a lot of information and just skated on the surface of a lot of this information. And Sarah, in particular, has so much to share in terms of the sciencing that she's been
Mhm.
doing. And she's been an educator for decades, and she has a very clear way of articulating and describing things. And she's recently launched a podcast, a Diabetes Game Changer podcast, and she has tons of articles that break down the science and deliver really practical advice for people who are looking to make changes in their lives. And so I just want to strongly recommend that you jump over to Diabetes Game Changer and check out her stuff. Listen to the podcast. I always tell her I want every single article in the podcast form so I can listen to it while I'm out for my walks. It's super easy to digest and will just help you to absorb a bit more of what we've talked about today.
Wow.
Well,
So,
thank you. Geez, Louise, that was
I
very
know.
nice.
Marketing, okay?
Yeah, this is fun. It's out there and it's
But
free.
really, it's like Katherine said, N of one. We need to be able to science ourselves
Yes,
because we can't count on necessarily hearing the message from our medical providers or our dietitians or whatever. We can't count on that. We need to science ourselves with an N of one to figure out what works for us, both for
that's right.
IBS and insulin resistance, both things.
Yeah, I just love it. And again, why did I call myself metabolic health doc? Because I know there's multiple ways to get there.
Yeah.
And I love the theme of this podcast, which is partly besides, showing a connection between IBS, diabetes, insulin resistance, is to say to people, listen, that N of one experiment is really how you get to the promised land. And we're
Yeah.
all different, uniquely created.
Yep.
And we need to honor that and uniquely look at what's going to work for us. So please, guys, if you're in the low carb, keto, carnivore cult, relax. It's okay to deviate as
Yes.
long as what you're deviating to is serving you. So
Yes.
I really appreciate you guys being in the universe to help guide people. We're going to share all of those resources, but as we kind of get to wrap up, let's talk about how we're going to protect our nest. So let's start with you, Sarah. Over the next 12 months, let's talk about what you hope to focus on to protect your nest.
To protect my own nest. I love your nest acronym. I mean, I think the most powerful is the N of nutrition. Katherine sort of touched on that.
Mhm.
That's, thinking about nutrition differently rather than a food label or a
That's right.
or a recommendation. Is the nutrition, like you touched on, unique to me?
Yeah.
What works for me, and also understanding there's a bounty in there. It's not restriction, it's bounty. Um, E for exercise. I get some exercise every day. I call what I do getting exercise snacks, because exercise snacks, getting 5 minutes after sitting for an hour, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at lunchtime, those exercise snacks are incredibly powerful for controlling blood sugars, especially if you do it right after eating. And then I think less stress, more sleep. So those are kinds of the kinds of things I'm working on for myself, that I love the outcome of working on those.
I like that. I love exercise snacks. That's very catchy. So we definitely want to. I like that a lot. So that's amazing. So go ahead, Catherine. What would you like to
Yeah,
say?
I'm going to start with the S because I spend a huge amount of time in nutrition, and I'll talk about that. But for me, sleep has been a bit tricky as I get older. I just don't sleep as much. I wake up. I'm not getting as much sleep as I think I need, and sleep has a big impact on our leptin and ghrelin, which are those hormones that control satiation, that control hunger. And so when we don't get enough sleep, then those are out of whack. Then, you might be hungry at an odd time of day. You might, eat more than you plan to eat. So sleep is one of those things that we don't really think about how important it is in terms of contributing to our overall good health and our nutrition in particular. So talked about FODMAPs a lot. We've talked about the fact that I love to cook and I love to create recipes, and I create a couple of new recipes every week that go out to all of my followers, and I love it. It's a very creative outlet for me. I love eating the food that I create. I love sharing it with
Me
my
too.
and
Yes.
and so sleep is one of those things that we don't really think about when we think about our gut, but it's very important. Nutrition, obviously, very important. And I've mentioned exercise and stress. Right? Exercise just moves you, right? Go for a
Yeah.
walk. You'll notice it just moves you. It's relaxing. It settles your system. It impacts your stress level. So all these things are super tied together. And even though we have this great NEST acronym, we really need to think about them as, one thing. We are one person who's impacted by all of those things.
Yeah. I had to honor who I am and what I believe when I thought about this podcast and what that nest represents. But more importantly, when people are in front of me and they struggle, I start to look at that nest and that rope, and look at those words and say, what part of that is the root cause of their struggle? So I really appreciate that. And having exercise this morning before we recorded, I just feel completely different than I would have felt if I had not done that. Mental clarity, I feel like just jumping right now. So I really appreciate that. So as we wrap up, you've mentioned the resources. Maybe really quickly, just summarize some of the links that we're going to have for our audience that they need to be thinking about in terms of how they can get to you guys.
Yeah, so I am at IBS Game Changer everywhere on all the socials. My website is IBS Game Changer. We'll include the link to my recipe club, which is prominently linked from my website as well. The recipe club's in Patreon. And you can find everything at IBS Game Changer.
Nice. And what about you, Sarah?
Yeah, mine is pretty simple too. Mine is Diabetes Game Changer. We started we call these our sister sites, because we
Yes.
both, we're best friends, and we created our specialties together. So there's a lot of crossover there. But I'm at Diabetes Game Changer. My email is sarah@diabetesgamechanger.com. I do have a podcast called Diabetes Game Changer, which you can find on at least Apple and Spotify. On Instagram, I'm fasting nurse practitioner, because that intermittent fasting was another thing that I started out doing, and we didn't talk about that, but that's a tool in the toolbox for helping to control insulin resistance. So at fasting nurse practitioner on Instagram.
And I should
Nice.
mention I am also Katherine at ibsgamechanger.com if you want my email.
Right.
All right. Well, I love that.
Easy to
And thank
remember
you.
all these things.
I know. Well, I've uh I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned some things, and I hope my audience has, opened up their mind. I didn't know what a FODMAP was until I got my master's in nutrition and functional medicine. I had never heard of it as a doctor. So I am always happy to integrate my functional medicine knowledge into these conversations. And I just really adore you guys. And, you know, and I keep going back to that song, "We Are Family." I
Yes.
got my 2 sisters with me. So we're gonna be singing,
Yes.
"We Are Family" together because you guys are doing a great work. I love the fact that you guys are best friends and looking like twins while doing it, and I just wanna thank you guys for, us connecting and getting you in front of my audience. I think they're gonna enjoy this interview, and, thank you so much for all you do.
Well, we're
Well, same
honored.
to you.
We're honored to be your honorary sisters.
That's
That's
right.
right, absolutely. I'm gonna go tell my wife right after this interview. We got the family just grew, so thank
Yeah.
you, and I'll say a few closing comments. Today, guys, we have uncovered the link between insulin resistance and irritable bowel, and, I just love the fact that, some principles that came to my mind, a couple. One is that treating insulin resistance will not only help with IBS, but is linked to a multitude of other medical conditions as well. So here's the bonus, guys. Although we didn't talk much about those other medical conditions, we can actually potentially alleviate or even resolve many health issues by addressing and treating insulin resistance. So never forget the damage that excessive glucose can do to your body. We talked about that because it affects your blood vessels and your nerves all over your body. So I just love the fact that we have this other connection that maybe you didn't know about, and I'm glad that our guests were able to share that. Number two, is so important, particularly since we have some educators on this, podcast. That importance of ongoing education and learning, continuously seeking knowledge and staying informed allows us to effectively tackle challenges and to find solutions throughout our lives. So my hope is that you walk away from this conversation recognizing that interconnectedness between insulin resistance, IBS, and other health conditions, and that you're proactive in continuing to learn and gain that knowledge so that you and your families will be healthy. So by doing that, what's going to happen is you're going to walk towards wellness, right? You're not going to be on chronic medicines. You're not going to, be looking for the next pill. You're going to be trying to figure out how to get one of those recipes in your mouth. So I really thank you guys for coming to this episode of the Protecting Your Nest podcast. And until we do it again, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.